3 months after the alignment, the first loom had become a classroom, and Tibijia had become the kind of man who noticed when a boy wept over thread. The first unified encoding cohort had started with 43 applicants. 7 dropped out on the first day, not from inability, but from the vertigo of discovering their life's work was a subset of something larger. 3 more left in the second week when the foundational exercises required them to unlearn muscle memory they had spent decades perfecting. 1 left when Quame's faction offered a counter-program, traditional encoding preservation, operating from a rented hall across the city, teaching the old curriculum with the ferocious conviction of people defending a world that had already ended. 32 remained. Then word spread through the weaving communities. By the 6th week, the cohort had grown to 36, and the 36 included weavers who had traveled from satellite villages across the north, carrying their looms and their questions and the unsettling certainty that their enchanted garments had been behaving differently since midnight on the alignment and nobody could explain why. Zuera taught. She had Mariama's pedagogical instincts, the ability to translate complex encoding theory into physical practice, to make the abstract tangible by putting thread in hands and saying weave. The unified encoding was not an abstraction to be memorized. It was a frequency to be felt. And the feeling began in the fingers, in the tension of warp against weft, in the specific resistance of enchanted thread, being channeled through a pattern that connected to something larger than any single loom. Tibijia guarded. Not the physical security, the guild's own wardens handled locks and doors. He guarded against the subtler threats, institutional sabotage from Quame's faction, competitive intelligence from other factions who wanted access to the first loom's curriculum, and the most dangerous threat of all, the human tendency to hoard what should be shared. He stood at doorframes and sat in corners and leaned against walls, and watched with the trained attention of a man whose entire contribution to a world of magic was the ability to see what others missed. A Tuesday in the 3rd month. The classroom, the guild's main teaching hall, 40 meters long, its wooden floor vibrating with the low thrum of the first loom's frequency transmitted through the building's foundations. 28 students at looms. 8 more at study tables working through Mariama's volumes, the pattern keeper's dense notation, gradually yielding its secrets to minds trained in the guild's narrower script. The smell of the hall was complex and human, lanolin from the thread, indigo dye from the vats in the adjacent room, the warm must of textile dust that every weaving hall accumulated over centuries, and beneath it, the sharper scent of enchanted thread channeling clean frequency. A smell like heated copper, and something sweet that Tibijia had never been able to name. Zuera stood at the demonstration loom, the oldest in the founding hall, positioned directly above the first loom's chamber. The shuttle road between them was active, the teaching looms encoding frequency feeding directly into the tapestry below, every pattern woven on the surface recorded in the deep archive. She was demonstrating cross-faction integration, the technique of weaving a pattern that combined the guild's textile encoding with the Tindana's root line notation, creating a hybrid that neither faction had produced independently. The students watched. Some took notes. Some mirrored the movements on their own looms, fingers working through the unfamiliar notation with the clumsy determination of people relearning their own craft. Then a boy at the 3rd loom laughed. Tibijia's attention shifted. The boy, Yakubu, 17, an apprentice from a satellite village near Yendi who had arrived with a practice loom strapped to his back, and the specific, hungry intensity of someone who had been told his questions were too big for his station, had been struggling with cross-faction patterns for 2 weeks. His fingers were clever, but his training was narrow, and the width of the unified encoding overwhelmed him the way an ocean overwhelms someone who has only ever seen rivers. But something had changed. Yakubu's hands were moving with a fluidity they had not possessed that morning. The pattern emerging on his loom was not Zuera's demonstration pattern, it was his own. A cross-faction integration that combined guild textile encoding with a fragment of shadow-binding notation he had encountered in Mariama's 3rd volume. The combination should not have worked. The notations were from different fragments, different traditions, different centuries of independent development. But on Yakubu's loom, under his 17-year-old fingers, they merged. The boy laughed because the thread was singing. Not metaphorically, the enchanted thread was producing an audible harmonic, a thin, clear tone that rose from the loom like a note from a stringed instrument. The sound of two fragments cooperating through a medium that was learning to hold them both. Yakubu looked up, his eyes were wet. "Teacher, it is working. I can feel it." Zueda crossed the hall, looked at the pattern. Her face did something that Tibijia had learned to read over 3 months of proximity, the micro-expression that meant she was seeing something that reminded her of Mariama.
"That is your own integration,"
As she said.
"Not from the lesson."
The thread wanted to go there. I followed.
"Then follow."
She placed her hand on his shoulder. Brief, warm, the gesture of a teacher recognizing the moment when a student stops copying and starts creating.
"The encoding serves the weaver, not the other way."
The boy wept, not from sadness, from the specific overwhelm of a 17-year-old discovering he could do something no one had taught him, that his hands knew things his mind had not yet understood, that the universe of his craft was larger than he had been told, and his place in it was real. Tibijia watched from the doorframe and filed the observation. The boy would bear watching, not with suspicion but with attention. Talent that arrived early and arrived strong needed guidance, not containment. He had seen the same dynamic in the military. The recruit who was too good too fast, who needed mentoring more than training, who would either become the best soldier in the unit or the most dangerous, depending on who stood beside them while they grew. He looked at his own forearms. The bandages were gone now. 3 months of healing had turned the burns into permanent scars. Mariama's cipher traced across his muscles in raised lines of silver-pink tissue. The geometric patterns hardened into a topography he could read with his fingertips even in the dark. The skin was tight where the deepest burns had contracted, pulling the texture of his forearms into something that felt like embossed leather, rough, ridged, warm. He had stopped hiding them in the 2nd month. The students had asked. He had told them the truth. He was the man who stood in the gap, and the gap left its mark. The scars did not hurt anymore. The deep, warm ache that had pulsed with his heartbeat for the first weeks had settled into something quieter, a background awareness, like the awareness of a healed fracture in cold weather. The cipher itched sometimes, especially when the encoding frequency shifted in the network around him. Not pain, awareness. A dead woman's message encoded in living flesh, responding to the system it was written in. He traced the largest line, a curve that ran from his left wrist to the inside of his elbow, the cipher's primary notation path. He could not read it, would never read it. He was the man with no magic, carrying a magical inscription he could not interpret, and he had found peace with the paradox. The cipher was not for him, it was for the system. He was the medium, not the message. He had formally left Ironhaven's military 6 weeks ago. The resignation letter to the Kambonaba had been brief, military writing, stripped of ornament. He had not explained the full context. He had written, "I have found a post that requires my particular skill set. The first loom needs someone who notices things and is not political enough to be compromised by what he notices." The Kambonaba's response had been a single line. "Granted, try not to get burned again." The military's idea of humor. His new post had no title, no rank, no chain of command. He was the first loom's observer, the man who notices things. Given a permanent assignment. He ate his meals in the guild's refectory. He slept in a small room off the teaching hall. He stood at doorframes and sat in corners and leaned against walls and watched, and the watching was the work. The students left at sunset. The teaching hall emptied with the gradual, reluctant energy of people who had found something they did not want to leave. Looms were covered. Volumes were closed. Conversations continued in the corridors, the animated, gesturing debates of weavers who had been shown a larger world and were arguing about its shape. Quiet settled. The building's daytime cacophony of shuttle clacks and thread tension and student voices faded into the evening hum of the first loom's frequency, transmitted through floorboards and stone foundations, the deep, steady pulse of a system maintaining itself. WuDon descended from the teaching loom. She looked tired, the specific tiredness of someone spending more energy than they were recovering, pouring knowledge out faster than rest could refill the vessel. Mariama's smock was draped over her shoulders. Her wrists were thin. The thread scars from the convergence were silver lines against her brown skin, catching the last light through the windows. Tibijia had prepared millet porridge in the small kitchen off the refectory. 2 bowls. Groundnut paste stirred into the grain, the way he had learned to make it during his first posting in the north. A young soldier's recipe, simple and filling, the kind of food that tasted like nothing to a person who was not hungry and tasted like everything to a person who was. They ate in the loom chamber. Not at the dais, on the floor, cross-legged, the amber light of the first loom warming them from below. The porridge was thick and savory, the groundnut paste giving it a richness that clung to the tongue. The warmth of the bowl seeped through Tibijia's scarred palms. The chamber smelled of heated quartz and old stone and groundnut and the faint, sweet scent of the encoding frequency at rest. WuDon ate slowly. She told him about Mariama, not the pattern keeper, not the convergence architect, but the mother. How she hummed while she wove, how her hands smelled of neem oil and indigo dye, how she made groundnut soup on market days and let WuDon stir the pot even though a child stirring made the consistency uneven. How she laughed, a sound WuDon was forgetting, the specific timbre of it fading despite her efforts to hold it. The way all sounds fade, except in the ears of the people who loved them. Tibijia listened. He told her about his first posting, a garrison on the eastern border, 3 months of watching a road that no one used, the boredom so comprehensive that he had memorized the migration patterns of the birds that nested in the garrison's walls. How the commanding officer had called him the man who notices useless things, and how the insult had become, over 12 years, the most accurate description of his value anyone had ever given him. They did not talk about the alignment. They did not talk about the convergence or the cipher or the guild's fracture or the custodian network or the system's restoration. They talked about groundnut soup and useless birds and a mother's laugh and a soldier's first post. 2 people finding ordinary friendship in extraordinary circumstances, the kind of friendship that grows not from shared crisis, but from shared porridge eaten on a stone floor in amber light after the students leave, and the building is quiet, and there is nothing to do but be human together. The silence that followed was comfortable. The loom hummed. The porridge cooled in the bowls. The amber light shifted as the tapestry recorded whatever the tapestry recorded in its permanent, patient archive. Then Tibijia noticed. He did not move. He did not speak. He let his eyes do what 12 years of training and 3 months of this specific post had refined to an automatic function. He looked at the tapestry, the 10-meter circular chronicle of woven light that held the Zagale's complete history. A thread, one thread. At the tapestry's outermost edge, beyond the section that had recorded the convergence, beyond the Guild Council's vote, beyond the first cohort's enrollment. A single thread that had not been there when they sat down to eat. The thread was blue. The rest of the tapestry was amber. This thread was the deep, saturated blue of pre-dawn sky, not woven in, not added by any mechanism Tibijia could see, but present. Growing. Extending itself along the tapestry's edge with the slow, deliberate pace of a root pushing through soil. It was warm. He could feel the warmth from where he sat, not the tapestry's ambient radiance but a different heat, rising from below, from the geological substrate beneath the chamber floor. The heat of the earth itself, channeled through the crystal columns and into the loom and manifesting as this single, anomalous thread. He noticed, he always noticed.
WuDon.
She looked, her eyes widened. The pattern keeper's perception reading what the soldier's perception had detected, a new element in the system's memory, uninvited, unexplained, writing itself into the archive with the quiet confidence of something that belonged.
That was not there yesterday.
Tibijia said.
No,
It is not the system's color.
no, it is not.
They looked at the thread. The thread grew. One blue line in a field of amber, extending itself along the tapestry's edge with the patience of something that had been waiting a very long time and was in no hurry now that it had begun. Tibijia filed the observation. The soldier who noticed things noticed one more thing. His forearms were itching. Mariama's cipher, burning beneath his scarred skin, responding to something in the chamber that the encoding frequency recognized even if the man carrying it could not. He did not scratch, he watched. The pattern was continuing, but the pattern was adding a voice that had not been part of the original composition. Something new, something blue, something warm from below. He filed it, he would retrieve it when it became relevant. It would become relevant sooner than he expected.